I'm Dr. Nathaniel Chin, and you're listening to Dementia Matters, a podcast about Alzheimer's disease. Dementia Matters is a production of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Our goal is to educate listeners on the latest news in Alzheimer's disease research and caregiver strategies. Thanks for joining us.
We interrupt today's episode with a word from the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. On this podcast, we often discuss different factors that can lead to cognitive impairment or dementia. Both memory loss and hearing loss are sometimes perceived as normal signs of aging, but both can actually be deeper indicators of brain health. Have you ever wanted to dive deeper into the impact of hearing loss on the brain? Join the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center for the annual Fall Community Conversation, happening Thursday, October 9th, 2025, from 4:30 to 7:30 p.m. Central Time at the Middleton Performing Arts Center in Middleton, Wisconsin, and live streaming on our YouTube page. This year's Fall Community Conversation is focused on exploring the science behind hearing and memory loss and why it matters for brain health, as well as empowering attendees to take steps to support their brain health. The event will feature a health and wellness resource fair, talks led by University of Wisconsin faculty, and a Q&A with the evening's presenters. To learn more about the Fall Community Conversation and how to attend, go to adrc.wisc.edu/FCC2025. That's adrc.wisc.edu/FCC2025, or find the link in the episode description. Thanks, and we hope to see you at the 2025 Fall Community Conversation.
Welcome back to Dementia Matters. Clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease treatments are instrumental in improving the quality of life for those diagnosed. With dozens of therapies and new approaches in development, the treatment landscape is always evolving and can be tough to follow. Thankfully, there are experts who dedicate their time to making it more accessible. Today, I'm joined by one such expert, Dr. Jonathan Graff-Radford. Dr. Graff-Radford is a behavioral neurologist and associate professor at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, as well as co-investigator in the Mayo Clinic Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and the Mayo Clinic Study of Aging. He's also the vice chair for the Mayo Clinic Department of Neurology. At the 2025 Spring ADRC Meeting held by the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center this past May, Dr. Graff-Radford presented a comprehensive overview of where Alzheimer's treatments stand now and where they're headed. And today he'll share some highlights from his presentation. Dr. Graff-Radford, welcome to Dementia Matters.
Thanks so much for having me here today.
So to start, John, what got you started in Alzheimer's, in the field in particular with clinical trials?
Well, I was always fascinated by the brain. In high school, I used to read books like by Oliver Sacks, like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, had a big impression on me. And so it was always in the back of my head that neuroscience may be a focus for me. And then when I went to medical school, I had some great mentors. I got to work with Ken Heilman, who was a behavioral neurologist at University of Florida, and Michael Oken, who was a movement disorder neurologist, and they really inspired me to pursue the field.
And then what about clinical trials, though? Because you could do a lot with behavioral neurology. Was there something in particular that drew you to that expertise?
During residency at Mayo, I got to work a lot with Dave Notman, who is a clinical trialist here, and got to see the clinical trials that we were offering, meet with the participants. And I was really inspired by the people participating in clinical trials, their altruism, as well as the family's commitment to try and find a cure for Alzheimer's disease, and how important it was to them that we offer clinical trials. And it really brought hope to a lot of them. So I wanted to be part of that. And so I started to get involved initially as a co-investigator and then became a site PI for several clinical trials here.
And of course, you're an active clinician, so you're seeing patients on a regular basis too. I'm sure that is meaningful for you to be able to see them in clinic and then ideally have them in research too.
Well, as a clinician, one of the common questions I get asked is what's coming down the pipeline in terms of new trials? And so it really is synergistic to be involved in both clinical care as well as clinical trials, because you can give them an overview of trials that are ongoing as well as the ones that are going to be starting up in the next few years.
Well, funny enough, that's exactly what this podcast is, John. So I'm glad we're sort of like your pseudo patient here. Now you are involved in both the Mayo Clinic ADRC, which has a longitudinal observational cohort, and clinical trials, which, as you just said, incorporates interventions. So how would you describe the difference between these types of studies to someone interested in just general Alzheimer's research?
So, longitudinal studies like the ADRC follow participants over time to look at the natural disease progression, and they don't intervene upon that disease progression. They're just trying to understand what are the risk factors for developing the disease, as well as how does that disease change over time. In contrast, a clinical trial is really testing a specific intervention to see if does that intervention help that disease, is it safe, and so they're really synergistic in our field. Observational studies provide really important knowledge about epidemiology and risk factors, and trials are the ones that are bringing the new therapeutics to the clinic.
For our listeners considering participating in a clinical trial, what are key aspects of this type of research and participation that you think they should know about?
Well, the first thing to know about is that it's voluntary. So it's completely that participant's choice. You can decide whether you want to be part of the trial. You can leave the trial at any time once you've joined it. So that's a really important first step to know about. Second is what to expect if you do a clinical trial. So you may receive a new treatment, but you may also receive sort of what a standard treatment in the field is, or a placebo, where you're getting a treatment that looks like the real treatment, but it doesn't have the active ingredients. So you want to know if, in the trial that you're enrolling in, what that setup is. The second part is what are the risks and benefits of participating in the trial. So you want to understand that are these new therapies, what are they looking to do, as well as have there been any safety signals in prior trials that you should be aware of when enrolling in these studies.
This wasn't originally on one of my lists of questions for you, John, but since I have your time here, are you seeing more and more both patients asking or patients participants asking about this and in the field in general, this concept of open label extension? Because to me it seems like it's a way of helping with recruitment, retention, but also just from the clinical perspective, if something's proven in a trial to be effective, as a participant you really want to be on that. And so if you could just explain for our listeners, open label extension and then your perception of how it fits in the AD space.
So, an open label extension is when a participant is done with the trial and they've gone into the trial, they've either received, say, placebo or the study drug. After the study's done and their outcome is firmly established and the data is locked, there's an opportunity for participants to all get on study drug. And this is important for a lot of participants who feel strongly that they've, given a lot to the trial and they want to make sure that they have an opportunity to be on that study drug, especially if it's promising. And certainly when there's a trial that's positive, that's of course particularly important to the study participants. And it's something they're asking more and more about as we're starting up studies.
And that kind of leads into my next question, which one of which is asking about phase 4 studies and what that actually means. But before we get to that, can you describe the differences in the phases of clinical trials and what happens with drug approval after a phase 3 study in particular?
So it starts with a phase 1 study. So that's a smaller study. You're testing the safety and what dose may be appropriate for that drug to go on. You're also seeing how that drug interacts in the body. If that passes phase 1, you'll move to a phase 2 study. And this is the study where you're starting to look at efficacy and side effects. And you're also trying to get a sense of, is the target being engaged? So if you're targeting, say, amyloid and Alzheimer's disease, do we have an amyloid biomarker that's being moved by this drug? And after that, those that are promising in phase 2 move to phase 3. And this is really confirming the effectiveness in a larger population. And this is what leads to regulatory approval. And these are the large studies to show that there's a clinical efficacy. And often in Alzheimer's disease, you're looking for both a cognitive and functional scale that has been improved upon with a treatment. And then, as you mentioned, after that, there's a phase 4 study as well, which is a post-approval study. And that's where you're seeing how these drugs perform in the real world. How do they do once they're being used widely, not just in a restricted trial population? Because one of the things about clinical trials is they often have a selected healthy group of people with that condition. And so in the real world, we want to know, are these effective, and what's the safety signal as well, importantly. And so that comes after you get the approval.
But not every study has to do a phase 4, though, right, John?
Correct. Yes.
And then before you get to phase 1, and I asked this because it just was asked of me by a patient. I think it's a great question. Before you get to phase 1, is it safe to say most drugs, if not all of them, have been tested in animals prior to getting to phase 1? Or what happens in that pre-phase 1?
That's a common pathway to have animal studies showing that there's a mechanistic reason to move it into phase 1. But there's occasionally studies where, these are compounds that are already widely used and you're repurposing them. And so that wouldn't necessarily require a phase 1. So sometimes there'll be, supplements that are widely used and considered to be safe that are being studied, and those wouldn't necessarily have the same pathway.
All right. Well, so with that in mind, I do want to start asking a few questions about specific trials that have happened, are happening, or you think will happen. And so, given your expertise, I'm hoping you can share sort of your interpretation, key findings you found from the 2 phase 3 trials related to amyloid removal. And so that being Clarity AD and Trailblazer-ALZ 2. What do you think are the most relevant takeaways for our listeners?
So, big picture takeaways, both trials showed that these monoclonal antibodies successfully remove amyloid. That's clear. And they also showed a slowing of cognitive and functional decline at 18 months. And it was a slowing in the range of 25 to 30%. So it's important to recognize that they don't stop the disease, they don't reverse the disease. It's a slowing of the decline. And there's been some debate in the field of how relevant this 25, 30% slowing is. But I think if you think about it on the CDR sum of boxes scale that was used for Clarity AD, you could consider it clinically relevant for some patients who would want to remain at a more mild stage of the disease for a longer period of time. But there's also some safety concerns that need to be raised. Both drugs cause what's called amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, or ARIA, and there's 2 types. One is brain edema, and the other is microbleeds or superficial siderosis, which are safety concerns that need to be monitored. Fortunately, these safety issues can be safely addressed with careful monitoring, and the FDA has sort of recommended an MRI schedule to do so. We've treated almost 100 folks here, and with the safety regulations in place, we've had very good success with very little side effects.
Is there anything different that you want to mention about the Trailblazer-ALZ 2, or do you sort of just consider those together?
Well, I think they are different. So Clarity, which tested lecanemab, one big difference is the frequency of dosing. So lecanemab is given every other week, and donanemab, which was in Trailblazer-ALZ 2, is given monthly. And so from a dosing convenience standpoint, that's a difference for patients. There was also difference in eligibility for the trials. And one of them, lecanemab, required a positive amyloid biomarker with an amyloid PET often. And donanemab used both an amyloid PET and a tau PET for inclusion criteria. So when you're trying to compare their efficacy and side effects, you have to realize these are actually different study populations. So it's hard to make a head-to-head comparison in terms of efficacy. So I explain to my patients that we can't make that determination of which one may be more effective than the other. But one of the things that did come up is that donanemab did have a higher rate of ARIA reported than lecanemab. But one of the key parts about a new therapy is understanding if we can start to deliver these drugs more safely and effectively. And just this year, they published a study that if you do a modified titration of donanemab, where you give less of a dose with that initial dose, but the same total amount in 6 months, you can decrease the ARIA rate from about 24% to 13% for ARIA-E, which is a pretty big difference. And so I think we're going to continue to see that the drugs can be delivered in a way that can be safer if we continue to learn from these follow-up studies.
And you mentioned two things in your answer, John: clinical meaningfulness, and one, it's being debated, but it's important to be able to talk about that. And then two, time, and that being a measure. So you'd mentioned slowing over 18 months, and I'm just curious how you in clinic now explain that to, let's say, a patient that has mild cognitive impairment that's thinking about, well, should I go on this therapy? How do you explain the potential benefit? You've done a nice job of explaining the potential risk with ARIA, but how do you frame that, the potential benefit?
What I try and make sure they understand is that this is a slowing and not a stopping. And so I really try and convey that while we do want to maintain you at your current level, we're not going to expect improvement, and we're not going to expect that the disease is going to stop. It will get worse over time, but we're hoping with these drugs that we're slowing down how this will progress. And on average, which is not the case for an individual patient, we're looking at a 30% slowing, which is sort of annualized to about 3 to 4 months of relatively preserved cognition annually. And for different people, that could be quite meaningful. Or for other people, particularly those where the infusions might be a hassle, they may decide, if it's not a cure or a stopping of the disease, this isn't the drug for me. And in fact, when we've looked at it, when we review people for safety and offer them the drugs, about 80% of people go on to start the drugs. And that means about 20% of people here at our center are saying, even though I'm eligible, based on the risk benefit profile, these aren't the drugs for me.
And before we get into the prevention space, can you tell us a little bit about the two other anti-amyloid drugs being studied, that being remternetug and trontinemab?
Sure. Remternetug is given subcutaneously as an anti-amyloid drug. So first, one of the concerns about the current drugs is that they're given by infusion. So people have to go into infusion center for them, which makes it challenging to scale them. And lecanemab, fortunately, was just approved for subcutaneous therapy for maintenance therapy just this last few weeks, which is a big step in the right direction to being able to treat more people. But remternetug is subcutaneous from the start, which is a key advantage. It's also thought to potentially have superior amyloid clearance and fewer reactions when they get the drug as well. And so it's being studied in a couple of studies. One is called Trail Runner ALZ 3, which is taking people with either no cognitive impairment yet, but a positive amyloid biomarker, or minimal cognitive impairment. So they are letting in people who sort of are on that threshold of mild cognitive impairment. And it's looking at 18 months of home administered therapy and looking at, can you delay the conversion to, say, MCI on the CDR. And so that'll be an interesting study because it's going to look at a potentially safer, more effective anti-amyloid agent, and also being able to deliver it in the house versus having to come into the clinic for it. Trontinemab is one that I think my colleagues have gotten very excited about because of the neuroscience behind it. So it uses what's been termed the brain shuttle to enhance this blood-brain barrier crossage. And what they did is they took gantenerumab, which was a monoclonal antibody that actually was not effective in clinical trials. It removed amyloid a little bit. It did cause ARIA, but it didn't hit any of the clinical endpoints that lecanemab and donanemab hit. But what they did is they took gantenerumab and they fused it with a fragment that binds to the transferrin receptor, and that allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier very effectively. So it's getting into the brain at a much higher level. And in the early studies, they've shown that it clears amyloid very fast and has minimal side effects. What I mean by that, minimal ARIA. But minimal doesn't mean no ARIA. And there was one case of someone who had baseline features of amyloid angiopathy, like superficial siderosis, who did die within the study. And so even with these, newer antibodies, we're going to have to be vigilant about monitoring and screening people for safety. But it is an exciting one because of how quickly it removes amyloid and how few side effects have been seen so far.
That does sound very exciting. And now I do want to move a little bit more into the prevention space. And so for our listeners, what should they know about the AHEAD study and then Trailblazer 3 study. And just so you know, John, in your answer, Dr. Risa Sperling has been on to talk about the AHEAD study, so you don't have to give us a lot of the background. And for our listeners who haven't heard that episode will be in the show notes. But John, what do you think they should know, key takeaways from these two important prevention studies?
So the AHEAD study, as you mentioned, Risa Sperling's the PI of it, and it's testing whether we can remove amyloid before people have symptoms and potentially delay or even prevent Alzheimer's in some individuals. And so they had a very innovative screening technique using a blood biomarker. And then if that was positive, they got a PET scan to measure their amyloid in their brain. And it's testing to see if once someone has a high amount of amyloid, can we remove it and, delay or prevent clinical symptoms from occurring? The Trailblazer ALZ 3 is also a preclinical study, but it's using donanemab, not lecanemab. And it's designed a little bit differently. It's a decentralized design. So it's using remote cognitive screening, blood biomarker testing. And so it has a reduced participant burden, which is intriguing for those interested in being able to deploy these more widely in different populations that normally wouldn't have access to them. And it's also looking at, can removing amyloid at this early stage before symptoms develop delay or prevent Alzheimer's disease symptoms from occurring? So both are very exciting, and 2027, 2028, hopefully they'll be wrapped up and we'll have that answer of early amyloid treatment for the field. And there's a lot of people who feel that may be the best time to test amyloid removal, more so than after people already have symptoms, because as people in the biomarker space know, people who have mild cognitive impairment can have a lot of tau in their brain. And so treating people at that earlier stage may be an ideal time for them to see if that works.
And there's one other trial in the Alzheimer's space that I think made a lot of headlines, and that was related to brexpiprazole and the treatment of agitation associated with dementia. Can you tell us what exactly this drug is, and what did the study show?
So it's an atypical antipsychotic, and it works on serotonin and dopamine receptors. And this is really important for the Alzheimer's space because as we've moved into these disease modifying therapies, there's a lot of people with symptomatic Alzheimer's disease that have challenging symptoms, and agitation is one of them. And so this drug was approved for agitation related to Alzheimer's dementia, and it showed a modest effect at decreasing agitation. And it's a big deal for the Alzheimer's field because we haven't had many successes when it comes to neuropsychiatric symptoms and those trials. And so I think it's, again, a step in the right direction. Definitely more needs to be done. But there's a couple of cautions. One is because it's an atypical antipsychotic, it comes with a black box warning, like all atypical antipsychotics and dementias, that in the elderly with dementia, they're associated with an increased risk of death. And it's thought to be cardiovascular typically. And so there should be some caution when prescribing it. But it's important for us to, talk about it because it is another recent success in therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease, when we went about 20 years between the prior drugs and these anti-amyloid agents.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant drought of success there, John. Now, in my last section of questions, I'd love to hear a rundown, just other studies that are happening or will happen in the near future that you find to be exciting.
So one of the ones that's coming up this year that I think the field's very excited about are the EVOKE trials, and they are studying GLP-1 agonists in Alzheimer's disease. So many people have seen the trials of GLP-1 agonists for diabetes, for weight loss, for sleep apnea, for fatty liver disease, and they've consistently shown that they can, improve diabetics' blood sugar, help people lose weight, and actually decrease sleep apnea. And so now they're being studied in Alzheimer's disease, and there's a couple of mechanisms of action that people are interested in. One is they improve blood vessel health. So if you lose weight, you get your blood sugar under good control, you're going to have healthier blood vessels. The second is that they may have neuroinflammatory effects. And so the combination of those two may be very helpful in Alzheimer's disease. And so it's anticipated that later this year, we're going to hear the results of that trial. And the cool thing about these studies is they were done with an oral GLP-1 agonist. And so this would be something that's easily deliverable to folks compared to some of those infusions. So I think that's one big one that we're waiting for. There's a couple other exciting trials I'll just mention. One are trials targeting tau. So I mentioned we've discussed amyloid for most of this podcast, but there are some interesting compounds in the tau pipeline. One of them is called BIB80, and it's a intrathecally delivered tau agent. So it's actually given through the cerebrospinal fluid, and it really targets the microtubule-associated protein tau and decreases its production. And Kath Mummery a few years ago presented the initial data and showed that it can actually decrease tau PET signal, which is really one of the few drugs that we've seen that engages tau that strongly on a biomarker standpoint. And so it's now being tested in phase 2 trials in Alzheimer's disease, in MCI and mild dementia. So even though it's challenging to administer, it's really important for the field because it's one of the first ones to show that degree of target engagement for tau. The other ones I'll just mention quickly are the ones that are happening in autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease. So these are people with the genetic mutations that run in families. And so the Diane study is doing a combination therapy study where they're looking at combining the anti-amyloid agents with the anti-tau agents. And that's an exciting place to be. So they're using a tau agent called E2814, and they're looking at whether that additive effect of targeting two parts of the Alzheimer's disease cascade will be more effective. And that's also happening within the Alzheimer's tau platform, where they're going to test lots of tau, or hopefully several tau agents at the same time, and see which one prevents tau uptake the most on PET scans, and then move that one to phase 3 so you can have a quicker turnaround for these trials. So those are the big ones that I'm very excited about, but there's lots more out there as well.
Well, so to end today, John, what are your
Thank you
key
for listening to
questions
Dementia
for the
Matters.
future of Alzheimer's
Follow us on Apple
treatments?
Podcasts,
what do
Spotify,
clinical
or
trials
wherever
do
you
you need
listen.
to address?
Or tell your
given
smart
all
speaker to
the
play
recent
the Dementia
successes that
Matters
you've talked about?
podcast. Please
So
rate
I
us on your
think
favorite
one
podcast
big
app. It
thing
helps
is
other people
how do
find
we
our show
optimize
and
the
lets us know how
timing
we're
of
doing.
combination
If you
therapies?
enjoy our show and
So
want to support our
anti-amyloid
work,
and anti-tau
consider making a gift to the
agents are
Dementia
coming, but
Matters
there's other
Fund
combination
through the
therapies
UW
looking at
Initiative to End
inflammation
Alzheimer's.
as
All
well,
donations
and
go toward
who and
outreach
when
and
you should give
production.
these drugs is a
Donate
really
at the link
important
in the
question.
description.
We also
Dementia
need to
Matters is
continue to
brought to you by
identify
Wisconsin
subgroups
Alzheimer's
who might be
Disease Research
responders to
Center
different
at the
treatments.
University of Wisconsin
We're already
Medicine.
seeing that
It
with the
receives funding from
anti-amyloid
private,
agents that it
university,
appears that
state, and national
people have a low
sources,
amount of tau
including
at
a grant from the
baseline do
National
best with
Institutes on
these
Aging
drugs.
for Alzheimer's
Can we
Disease
continue to make
Research.
these drugs
This episode
safer?
of Dementia
We already
Matters
have
was produced
some
by
progress
Caitlin
in that
Rowerdink
space.
and
And what are the
edited by
long-term
Alexia
outcomes of these
Spevacek.
people? We only
Our musical
have now
jingle is Cases to
48-month
Rest by
data,
Blue Dot
but it's going to be
Sessions. To learn
important to
more about the
continue
Wisconsin
to follow
Alzheimer's
people who have
Disease
been
Research
treated
Center,
to see
check
what
out our
happens to
website
them.
at
And then a big thing is how do we address
adrc.wisc.edu.
non-Alzheimer's disease
That's
co-pathologies like cerebrovascular
adrc.wisc.edu.
disease
And
and other
follow us on
comorbidities
Facebook and
in
Twitter.
trials?
If you have
And
any
then are
questions or
there
comments,
any
email us
neuroprotective
at
strategies that we can employ as well to enhance that disease modification?
Thanks for listening.
Well, with that, John, I'd really like to thank you for being on the podcast, going over this incredible overview on clinical trials. And I certainly think we're going to have you back on to talk more about Alzheimer's research.
Well, thanks so much for having me.